So to answer the big question that you probably have, yes, you can knit on the plane. Hello, my name is Katrina Walser from Oliphant and I'm a knitting teacher, designer and tech editor based in Sydney in Australia. And welcome back to my channel. Now I think I should be saying welcome back to myself as well, because it's been a good 10 months since I posted a video on YouTube. And the idea of updating you all on what's been going on in those last 10 months is pretty daunting. I'm still trying to figure out the best way of doing it. But while I think about it, I figured that I would take the opportunity instead to make a video that I've been wanting to make in a while, which is how to knit on a plane and just how to travel with your knitting in general. So we are about to get on a flight from Sydney to North Carolina in the US tomorrow. So I figured that I would take some shots of how I've been packing and a little bit of footage, hopefully, of our trip. And I'll give you some tips on how to get on the plane safely with your knitting, what you should pack and what sort of projects you should choose, as well as some general travel tips. So this is mostly going to be plane focused, but stick around anyway if you are traveling soon, because the tips should be helpful for any sort of long travel that you're doing where you need to knit in a small space. So to answer the big question that you probably have, yes, you can knit on the plane. I've been doing it for a good decade or so, and I've never once had my needles confiscated. And really, it's a great time to get some rows in, because all you're doing is just sitting down in this tiny space for probably at least an hour, if not more. So it's a good time to do some knitting. Now, the first thing you need to remember is the people who determine whether you can bring your needles onto the plane are not the airline that you're flying, it is airport security. So what you want to do is think through your itinerary and figure out which airports you're going to be going through security in, and then look up the websites for the custom and border protection for the countries that those airports are in. So for example, I'm going to be getting on the plane in Sydney and flying to Dallas in Texas, and then we'll be getting on a domestic flight from Texas to North Carolina. So I'm going to be looking up the Australian Border and Customs Protection site. I think that's what it's called. They don't have a fancy name. And I would also look up the TSA site, which is the security site for the US airports. So I've never had my needles confiscated, like I mentioned, but I have very often had my bag flagged after it was sent through the X-ray at security. The problem is that a lot of people are unfamiliar with either circular or interchangeable needles. The general public who don't knit still think of knitting needles as long straight sticks. So if you're flying, especially with circulars or interchangeables, give yourself some extra time to get through security, because it's pretty regular or a pretty common occurrence that they'll pull your bag aside and at least take a look at the needles to confirm that they're knitting needles. And I've even had some people still be unsure and they run off and find a colleague or their manager to come take a look at my bag and double check that they are needles and confirm that they're allowed onto the plane. So definitely make sure you give yourself a bit of extra time at the airport so you're not rushing through trying to get onto your flight. If you're especially worried about your project or your needles, there are a couple of things you can do. And again, I've never done any of these things because I've never needed to, but they're tips that I've heard from other people. So you can bring some waste yarn or some of those like silicone barber cords. So if someone tells you that you can't bring your needles onto the plane, you can at least save your project by threading the waste yarn or the barber cords through your knitting and then just leaving the needles behind. Or alternatively, people often don't have trouble with the cords, they just don't like the needles. So if you're using interchangeables, you can bring the end stoppers for your cables and just pop the needles off and put the stoppers onto the cables and just bring your project onto the plane and just not actually work on it. If you're really worried about your needles as well, I've heard people say that you can bring a pre-addressed envelope for yourself in your carry-on so that if you're really stuck, you can pop the needles back into the envelope and try and find a post office at the airport and just send them home to yourself. So the needles are generally fine. The thing that I've had the most trouble with are scissors. So goodness. I've had so many issues with scissors. So the first thing to know is that different countries have very different rules. For example, I had a pair of little embroidery scissors that I loved. They were very short. And I lived in America for a while. I traveled with them all over the States because the TSA website says you can bring on scissors as long as the blade is less than 4 centimeters or something like that. So traveled with them for years. The first time I tried to go through Sydney airport with them, they pulled me aside and told me that they were too pointy. So they didn't care about the length. They just said they were too pointy and too sharp, and I had to throw them in the bin. So I would advise actually just not bringing scissors on at all. There are alternatives that you can bring, but make sure you plan for them. Don't be like me, because I have previously sat on a plane trying to saw through my yarn with my keys because I didn't have a cutting implement. It doesn't work, trust me. So make sure that you bring on something that you can cut with that isn't scissors. So the two main options that I think that you have, you can buy a certain type of notion that I think is called a thread cutter. I know my friend Lisa from 1121 Mills actually sells these, so I'll try and get some footage of one to show you here, and I'll make sure to link to them on her website. But it's basically a brooch that you can pin to your project bag or keep in your notions bag, and it has a tiny little thread snipper inside that's not an exposed blade, so you can just use it to cut your yarn. The other easier alternative that you probably have lying around in your house are nail clippers. So most airports will let you bring nail clippers onto the plane now. Again, check the websites because they do have different rules, but I've never had an issue with nail clippers. So as long as you have a clean pair that you can use, most nail clippers will get through most types of yarn. So if the first step is getting through security, the next step is figuring out what to actually knit on the plane. So my main tip, if there's anything you take away from this, is to take a project that is simple. Once you get onto the plane, it's a pretty confined space, so you don't really want to be having a lot of equipment and a lot of notions and a pattern that you really have to check off every row with a highlighter and a cable chart tracker. So just bring something that's fairly simple that doesn't need a lot of equipment. If you have, for example, a sweater or a garment that is up to just the plain stockinette part where you're just going round and round in stockinette, that's perfect. But beyond that, a couple of things to look out for. So if you do need your pattern, make sure you either bring a hard copy or you download it onto your device. So I am a big proponent of using your phone or your iPad because I don't like using paper patterns. But I've had issues before where I've opened the pattern on a tab in my phone browser, and once I got onto the plane, for some reason the phone decided to reload that tab, but I didn't have any internet because I was on the plane, so I just lost my pattern. So make sure you download the pattern onto your device, either by opening it up in the PDF reader app on your phone, or on the iPhone and the iPad, there's a books app that I usually export the patterns onto to make sure that it's sitting on the device. If you're using a paper pattern, that also works, but just make sure that you can tuck it into the side of your seat or into your project bag. So you should also bring a project bag. Now the thing with knitting on a plane is that there's not a lot of storage space. So once you get on, they really want you to put as much stuff as possible into the overhead compartments. And you can put a backpack or a small item under the seat in front of you during takeoff. But that's not super helpful if you're trying to knit because it's a pretty long distance from where you're sitting to where your backpack will be. So you don't really want your yarn running all the way down there. So what I usually do is I make sure to bring a project bag and just stuff the needles and the project and the single skein or 2 skeins if it's color work that I'm working from into the project bag, and just keep that next to you on the seat. If you're really worried about it, you can put the blanket over you so that no one tells you off for having something in the seat during takeoff. So if you just stuff that in next to you, then that usually works out okay. Now, project bags, I usually try to bring something that closes, because the last thing you want to do is have a ball of yarn jumping out of your lap and running down the aisle, and you having to try and find it and ask all the people behind you to pass the yarn up under the seats, which I don't remember if it's happened to me before, but it's definitely something that can happen. So try and bring a project bag that closes. I usually bring one either with snaps or with a drawstring so that I can feed the yarn through the top of the bag while it's closed. I don't like bringing zipper ones because it always scares me that if I have the yarn coming out through the top of the zipper, it will snag on the zipper. So snaps or drawstrings work really well. Now, the other thing you need to decide is what sort of fiber that you're going to be knitting with. Please, please, take it from me, do not bring anything that sheds. I one time was knitting with, I don't think it was mohair, but it was some sort of sheddy wool. And I was happily knitting away on the plane. And after we got off the plane, when the guy who was sitting next to me, who I didn't know, stood up, the whole side of his clothing was covered in yarn fibers. And I was so embarrassed, and I didn't know whether or not to tell him, and I chickened out and I didn't tell him, and I really hoped that he noticed before he got to wherever he was going. So remember that on a plane, you're in public at the end of the day, and you're in a very confined space. So anything that goes into the air is going to land on someone. So make sure you knit with something that's not going to shed. Now, in terms of notions, really, again, try and keep it to a minimum if possible, just so you're not juggling so many different things. But if you need some stitch markers, bring on some stitch markers. If you need your barber cords or some waste yarn because you've got different parts of your project you're going to need to be putting on hold, make sure you do that. Definitely think through what needles you need. So I tend to try and just get all the needles that I need and put them into the project bag, so you don't have to go rummaging around in lots of different places trying to find your needles. So for example, I'm probably going to be taking a beanie onto the plane, and I know that I'm going to have to switch into a smaller needle size for the ribbing. So I'm going to make sure I have those needle tips in my project bag as well. Okay, for this last little segment, I've been joined by a special guest. He's sitting down here because he just woke up from his nap. So apologies in advance if there are any strange noises that come from this general direction, but we'll try and keep it quick. So the last thing I wanted to chat about was how to plan for the projects that you're going to be knitting while you're on a trip. So depending how long your flight is and how long your actual holiday is, you may end up wanting to have extra projects that you knit after the plane or after you finish the project that you're working on the plane. Now, those can be a little less restrictive because once you're at your destination, there won't be the same restrictions around how big the seat is and how much equipment you can have and stuff like that. So you can bring something a bit more complicated if you want to. But if you are going to be bringing more complicated things, and especially new cast-ons, just make sure that you think through all the things that you need to bring along with you and the things that you'll be leaving at home. So the big pieces of equipment that I find that I miss while I'm gone are both my skein winder and ball winder, as well as my scale. So first off, I'm going to be bringing a project along with me. That's a t-shirt project, but the yarn is still in skeins. So it's actually this project up here. So I need to ball this up before I go. So I'm going to spend some time this afternoon or tonight winding it up so that it's ready to knit from once I get to my destination. I also am going to weigh this yarn and all the yarn that I'm bringing along for new cast-ons because I like to track my yardage pretty carefully, and the best way of doing that is to weigh it. But my scale is pretty bulky and it plugs into the wall, so it's not very travel friendly, so I'm going to make sure I do that before we leave. And then that way, once I come home and I've cast off, I can weigh whatever's remaining and then I'll know how much was in my project. The last thing as well that you want to think about, that I'm especially thinking about for this trip, are any bulky books that you have that you're going to be knitting patterns from. So I got this beautiful book from the library. It is genuinely coffee table worthy, and I want to knit a jumper out of that, but it's too heavy to bring along, especially just for one pattern. So I'm going to be either scanning the pages or photocopying them, but I do like digital, like I mentioned, so I'll probably scan them. Okay, so that's all of the tips that I have for you. Hopefully that was helpful. I know a lot of people travel around this time of year. It's summer in the Northern Hemisphere, which I'm very excited to go to. And so that tends to have a lot of traveling associated with it. But even here in the winter, down here in the Southern Hemisphere, I know a lot of people are going on holidays, especially around school holidays with their kids. So hopefully this will be helpful for you as you're planning for your trips and while you're on them. If you did like this video, please like and subscribe. It would really help me out, especially coming back to YouTube. I don't know if they're going to decide to help me out by giving me a bit of a bump because I've been away for so long. But if you do like and subscribe, that would help me heaps. And I'm sure that would help more people see my videos as I start my channel back up. If you do want to find out more about me and the videos that I've been making in the past, or you want to catch up with what I left you all off with before I start catching you up with what I have been doing in the next couple of videos, then you can watch a playlist of all of my previous podcasts right here. And if you want to make sure you're notified when I do start posting more stuff and finally give you that big life update, then you can subscribe just down here. Other than that, I've been Kat from Oliphant Cat, and I'm really glad to be back. Happy knitting and talk to you next time.